Welcome, seekers of hidden knowledge, to the mystical realm of the occult. Delve into the secrets of the universe as we journey together into the enigmatic world of ancient wisdom. Brought to you by your guide through the shadows of enlightenment, Wisdom Rocker. Uncover the mysteries, unlock the power, and journey with us as we explore the hidden depths within the pages of forgotten scrolls and ancient texts. Prepare to embark on a journey beyond the ordinary, where wisdom transcends time and knowledge is your greatest ally. Welcome to Wisdom Rocker. Prepare to awaken your inner sage. In this video, we will be uncovering the wisdom within the chapters of
Fragments of Truth by Richard Ingalese and Isabella Ingalese. Chapter 11. The Spiritual Renaissance of the 19th Century. There were less than 200 years left to the Piscean Age when the 19th century commenced. And, according to historical precedents, in other cycles, the religion of the world was decadent at such a time. The Hindu gods were dead. Allah and Muhammad were so decrepit that even a holy war could not be conjured in their names. Jehovah had lost, through heterodoxy and atheism, most of his followers and was tolerated by the faithful only when he did not interfere with business. Christianity was merely formal and had disintegrated into almost as many sects as there were days in the year. Its trinity of gods were moribund, and were scarcely ever mentioned in polite society, politics, or on the stage. The Holy Ghost had almost faded into the circumambient atmosphere from whence it came. The Father had not been deprived of his great white throne in space, but was not permitted, in any way, to interfere with the affairs of the world, or with the plans of his children. The Son had a formal following who, for a few hours each week, paid, with flattery, the obligation they were supposed to owe him by reason of his alleged sacrifice. All the foregoing conditions applied to the general mass of men, but it is true that each of the religions had a few followers who were trying to grasp the spiritual significance of their respective faiths and to live the life. It is also true that each of the religious beliefs had some fanatical adherents of their theology and mythology, who were willing to die for their faith, but not to live it. During the closing days of each zodiacal cycle, or at the commencement of a new one, some great religious teacher comes to the world to awaken spirituality, and in each century of the cycle the movement is continued by lesser occultists. At the close of one solar cycle, or in the beginning of another, some great Messiah, Savior, or Avatar, descends to earth and incarnates to give a religious impetus to the new age. And, at this juncture of history, it happens that a solar and a zodiacal cycle are jointly closing, as was foretold by the Nazarene occultist, at the beginning of this Piscean period, when, at the importunity of his disciples, he described the consummation of the age. Because of the materialism of the 19th century, a superhuman effort had to be made to awaken any spirituality. The occultists were, of themselves, unable to cope with the situation, and a master of occultism, therefore, had to initiate the work, and once more the world was blessed with the physical presence of a God, who incarnated in the 19th century instead of at the beginning of the Aquarian Age. It is not altogether complementary to the intuition of many students of religion, that they were unable to recognize that Avatar, nor the scope of his work, and that they are still looking forward for a Messiah to come in the next century. History strangely repeats itself. 2,000 years ago the human race was looking for a Messiah king and failed to recognize the Messiah teacher. The few of this age, who are interested in the subject, are looking for a Messiah teacher, and fail to realize the messianic message and movement. The Aquarian teacher, who hastened his coming to the 19th century, did not intend, through his personality and powers, to impress the masses and to be worshipped by them. His purpose was not to start a new religion since the world was already afflicted by too many, but his object was to destroy all old religious forms in order that the spirit of each, which giveth light, might shine forth once again as a unified esotericism. By reason of his effort, all old religious forms are disintegrating and, in a short time, will have passed away. For the first 1,000 years of the Aquarian Age there will be no temples and no priests, but each man will find his own way to God, through self-discipline and by the study of ancient but perennial truths. After that time, possibly, history may repeat itself and the greed and ambition of a few, combined with the intellectual laziness and indifference of the many, may again create a priesthood and a new mythology. The Aquarian teacher worked through various channels and planted the seed in many soils. Some of his activities may be discussed but others must remain undisclosed, until revealed by the blossom and the fruit, in the fullness of time. His aids were the same, in the main, as were used in all previous periods, students of occultism. Some were conscious aids, while others were only partially conscious ones and still others were unconscious assistants. His work commenced about the middle of the 19th century and he laid down his body Sunday, June 24, 1900. By this it is not meant that he ceased, at that time, to work for humanity, because his efforts continued, on the inner planes of being, for a number of years thereafter, and will be continued, with the more progressive of the race, for some time to come. Nothing that has been said in reference to this great soul must be taken as implying, in any way, that the Nazarene teacher will not fulfill his promise and return at the close of this cycle. Having given his unqualified promise, he will necessarily keep it. But, while he will come, in the last days of this fast-closing age, in individual power and great glory, it does not mean that he will come in the manner selected by many of his ardent but mistaken followers. Nor will he come to judge the living and the dead, that being the respective duties of two of the planetary spirits, the gods of compensation. But the Nazarene will appear to those who have understood his teachings and have kept the faith. In the middle of the 19th century, atheism and agnosticism were characteristics of the educated class, and skepticism, which could not reconcile the precepts and the practices of their superiors, was characteristic of the serving class. Spiritism was commencing its recrudescence with the psychic manifestations of the Fox sisters. It was apparent to all occultists, who had conferred with the great teacher, that enormous possibilities lay within the new phenomena, and some occultists volunteered to stand behind that movement and to perform some of the astounding manifestations which later attracted the curiosity of the world. It was uphill work for the volunteers, and not at all pleasant, because of the character of many of the mediums who had to be utilized. But, in all previous history, phenomena had first awakened the curiosity of some men and later had engaged their interest or intelligence. It was not a time to consider the character of the means to be employed, so much as to use any and all available means, since the spiritual existence of humanity was at stake. At first, the materialists denied the existence of the phenomena, but when they had grown to such momentous proportions as to quell denial, then the materialists contended that the phenomena were produced by fraud, and, for a time, the world accepted this explanation. Churchianity both ridiculed and anathematized the movement, because it threatened the existence of the Church, for, if it could be established that, after death, good and bad men existed, in astral forms within the photosphere of the world, then what became of heaven and hell and the doctrine of the atonement? Without these basic, theological doctrines the Church could not exist. But, love was stronger than dogma, and many brave men and women persisted in investigating Spiritism, and the number of investigators increased until, finally, spiritualistic societies were established throughout the civilized world. Later some scientists, who were not imbued with crass materialism of the dominant German school, undertook to investigate Spiritism. During the second decade of the 19th century, science began to attack the dogmas of the Church and slowly doubt commenced to corrode creeds. The investigation of psychism, by scientists, gave a standing to the phenomena which they formerly lacked, and many members of the Church were converted into thinkers. So large and respectable, in the eyes of the world, did Spiritism become, that societies, for psychical research, were established among all nations, not entirely dominated by the Church. The occultists continued their work along these lines until the movement gained such impetus as to disintegrate dogma in the minds of millions of men. There were other occultists, who had specialized in philosophy rather than magic, and, under the great teacher, became active in other directions. Some of these sought to reawaken an interest in philosophy and psychology, two subjects of which the world was densely ignorant. Philosophy had become the unpractical realm in which a few dreamers dwelt, much to the amusement, or contempt, of their contemporaries. Psychology was barely kept alive, in small classes in the colleges, and there it was studied rather as the abnormal functioning of mind than of mind itself, with its powers and potentialities. Philosophy and psychology were both considered, by the ignorant world even of letters, as impracticable, and a stamp of that kind was conclusive in an age of materialism. But, among the more progressive philosophic students of the century, was one Dr. Quimby, who was conducting classes in Berkeley in philosophy, and among his pupils were a number of strong egos. This was a center that was quickly utilized, by the evolutionary powers, through which to stimulate the study of applied philosophy, especially in its relation to practical life. Truth is always colored by the medium through which it manifests. Being a physician, and a child of the age in which he lived, Dr. Quimby naturally sought to make his philosophy practical, particularly along the line of his profession. The basis of Berkeley's philosophy is that no object can be known except under the form which sense perception gives it. This of course Berkeley derived, as a conclusion, from Locke, who attacked a materialism which sought to make a self-existent, stupid, unthinking, substance the root and origin of all being, traced back step by step. Through a distinct line of philosophers, it finally reaches its source in a perverted, or one-sided, view of the idealism of Socrates. Quimby's contribution to the world was the application of Berkeley's philosophy to the curing of disease. If no object can be known except under the form which sense perception gives it, then, urged Quimby, by inhibiting sense perception of disease it is destroyed. Many of Quimby's pupils enthusiastically accepted this half-truth, as truth, and through mental suggestion put it into practical application. Neither Quimby nor his disciples seem to have grasped the philosophic truth which the occultists were trying to impress upon them, that knowledge is the result of the interaction of two factors, subject and object, though these may be, in themselves, two aspects of primordial essence. And that if there is subject and object, then inhibition of sense perception of disease only destroys a knowledge of, or a belief in, disease and not the disease itself, as has been demonstrated in many thousands of cases among the religionists of Quimby's applied philosophy. One of Quimby's pupils started the Christian Science movement and perverted the philosophic statement of Berkeley, and the semi-philosophic, but illogical conclusion of Quimby, to the fallacious dogma that there is no matter, no philosophic object. This unphilosophic principle was duly heralded as the discovery, by the founder of the movement, of a new truth, which, to a student of the idealism and of the nihilism found in many of the sacred books of the East, was as amusing as the discovery by a schoolboy of the multiplication table. Other students of Dr. Quimby founded the new thought movement which adhered more closely to the Berkeleyan philosophy. Both movements specialized in mental healing and gained, and continue to gain, about the same number of adherents, for both utilized the time-honored principle of attracting and convincing the mass through phenomena. Both movements drew largely from the Church and made a distinct step upward for those who joined the new schools of thought. When New Thought was well underway, Prentice Mulford was fortunate enough to meet with, and study under, a French occultist. Mulford embodied the occult philosophy, as he understood it, in 6 volumes entitled Your Forces and How to Use Them. These books made a profound impression upon the students of New Thought, broadening their views and showing them that their new thought was but a part of the oldest philosophy extant, occultism. Many students of Christian Science became dissatisfied with the limitations of their church, and left it to start other mental movements along broader lines. All these progressive thought schools and churches contributed their share toward awakening in man a consciousness of his divine nature and toward teaching him his actual and potential, mental, and spiritual powers. These schools caused a reaction on churchianity and awakened, in it, a knowledge that men were fast outgrowing the worn-out dogmas founded upon, or embodied, in the Nicene Creed. When the 3 described movements were well underway, or about the last quarter of the 19th century, a 4th effort was made by other occultists, under the Great Teacher, to enlighten humanity by destroying the crude creeds of all the old religions, commencing with the dominant one of the Occident. The exoteric head of this 4th movement was Madame H. P. Blavatsky, and the esoteric powers were the occultists assigned to work both behind and in that society. The first worker behind the scenes was that brilliant Occidental occultist, whose portrait was poorly painted by a member of the society and was afterward photographed for the benefit of some of the esoteric members. This worker was known by a number of names, but was, in point of fact, the ego formerly known as Cagliostro. To him had been entrusted the preliminary, esoteric education of Madame Blavatsky and the outlining of the society she was to establish. Later, 2 Oriental occultists known as M and K.H. took charge of directing the work through the Madame, and finally, in the last days of her life, a new teacher was assigned her, an occultist called H.P.B. or B, to distinguish him from his medium, the Madame. He was, in point of fact, Jacob Boehme in a former incarnation. The object of these diversified teachers was to attract to the movement associates and followers of former lives and persons of various races and castes, and of many mental differences. For the primal purpose of that organization was to establish a universal brotherhood, in the only way it could be done, namely, by studying Aryan and other Eastern literatures, religions and sciences, and by showing that, at heart, all religions and most sciences are one in essence: esotericism, or occultism. Another announced object of the Theosophical Society, which the new movement was called, was to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the psychical powers latent in man. According to time-honored tradition, this object was accentuated in the beginning of the society and the production of psychic phenomena outclassed, in every way, that produced in the other movements. Naturally, this attracted many people, first, through curiosity, and later, by reason of mental conviction. This society never acquired the large membership of many of the other organizations, but, nevertheless, did as great a work. Through its activities, some knowledge of a religious philosophy was inculcated into the Occident, which, prior to that time, was devoid of any. This philosophy of esotericism had to be given out sparingly, at first, and the early literature of the society was as much destructive to the pretensions of the old religions and sciences, as it was constructive in unfolding a knowledge of the old philosophy. Later, an esoteric, or inner group, was formed within the society, in which some of the teachings were given in a more exact manner than was taught the public. After Madame Blavatsky's death, the Mother Society first divided into 2 rival organizations, and later, from these, arose many others, as Madame Blavatsky foretold would be the case. The Mother organization had to do the pioneer work, the later societies and schools exhibited different progressive phases of that work. The fact that the mother society, and its children, jealously spend more time in criticizing each other than in attempting to form a nucleus of universal brotherhood, should be attributed to human frailty and not to a lack of merit in the purpose of each organization. As the human ego lives, occupying many successive bodies, so does truth manifest in many vehicles. It is evident, to anyone who will carefully analyze the organizations mentioned, that no single movement does more than express a phase of occultism. For example, Spiritism reveals the psychical power latent in man. Christian Science and New Thought the mental powers, while Theosophy presents an aspect of the ancient philosophy. Each movement has appealed, as it was intended it should, to that class of minds interested in the respective subjects. No one movement could have, at the time, attracted the students of the other movements because of the dissimilarity in mental characteristics. There are basically two classes of minds in the world: the contemplative, or rational, and the active or intuitional. In their undeveloped states each is tenacious of its original tendencies, but, as they evolve, each complements its deficiency by acquiring something of the nature of its opposite. It was natural, therefore, that Theosophy, or the philosophic movement, should attract the contemplative man while Christian Science appealed to the practical mind by a display of the force aspects of the ego, and that New Thought should be a step toward harmonizing the two elements. And in contradistinction to these mental movements stands the psychic. It was also natural, at the present stage of evolution, that gratitude and loyalty to a teacher for bringing a student out of dogma into light should have made fanatics of many undeveloped members of each group, and that, in consequence, all truth should be claimed by the members of each organization. But, as the organizers of each movement passed away, a greater tolerance grew up, and the interaction will, in time, not only broaden and enlighten the respective followers of each aspect of truth, but unitedly will influence the outside world. The thinking world has, already, been greatly helped by the teachings of each group, and it is not in membership but in influence that the importance of a movement should be measured. Millions of egos have, through private study, been helped by the literature, which has been issued, during the last half-century, by the various aspects of progressive thought. The mental reaction is seen even in the churches which have been compelled to abandon or suppress some of their dogmas. The object of the great teacher, in stimulating each of the foregoing movements, was the same: to bring about a spiritual renaissance, and not to perpetuate new churches, or cults. With the conclusion of the present cycle, these organizations, like those of all religions, will pass away, but the truths presented by them will, unitedly, enlighten unborn generations. It is thought, not forms, that persists. For this reason, perhaps, the greatest work done under the teacher was seemingly unorganized. Many occultists were delegated to collect, translate, and publish the works of ancient and medieval esotericists. There was no old Occidental occultist, whose teachings could aid in the Renaissance, who was overlooked, and all the sacred books of the East became the property of the world. Other modern esotericists were requested to supplement all that had been done with such complementary writings as would harmonize and complete the whole. Thus, has some of the work of the new master been publicly done, so as to administer to the needs of present humanity and to prepare the spiritual food for the quickly approaching Aquarian age.
Thanks for watching the Wisdom Rocker. Don't forget to like, comment, and share.